All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the California Air Resources Board's third public workshop on the draft and use locomotive regulation. Before we start, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping and just talk through how this webinar format's going to work. First of all, if you would like to follow along in Spanish, you'll need to download a copy of the Spanish presentation from our website, and then Gabby will put the link in the chat for you. We appreciate everyone joining us today, and always in the age of Zoom, please be patient with us if we have any technical difficulties along the way. Gabby, can you please just let the Spanish speakers know that we're about to begin?
Yes. Hola y bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por unirse al taller público de la Junta de Recursos del Aire de California. Si desea seguir viendo la presentación en español, por favor descargue una copia de la presentación en nuestro sitio web, el cual ya puse en el chat. Agradecemos a todos los que están aquí hoy y como siempre en la era de juntas por Zoom, queremos pedirles que por favor tengan paciencia con nosotros si encontramos alguna dificultad técnica a lo largo de la reunión.
Thanks, Gabby. This workshop is being offered real-time in both English and Spanish, and you can select your language preferences either English or Spanish. It should be available at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little globe. To get this to work, everybody has to select a language, even if your language is English. So at this time, please do so. Also, to listen to Spanish only, you'll need to click Mute Original Audio. Gabby, I'm just going to pause here so you can interpret.
Este taller se ofrece en tiempo real, tanto en inglés como en español. Puede seleccionar su preferencia de idioma, ya sea inglés o español, y puede encontrar esta función en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Para que esto funcione, todos los participantes deben seleccionar un idioma, incluso si se queda en el canal de inglés. En este momento, por favor, seleccione su idioma y si va a escuchar solamente en español, debe hacer clic en silenciar audio original o mute original audio en inglés.
I'd like to now introduce our interpreters, Claudia and Isrita, and give them a moment to provide instruction in the Spanish broadcast. Can Claudia or one of you let me know when you're ready to move to the next slide, please?
You're ready, Leila.
Okay, thanks. Spanish speakers, if you have a question during the meeting, please use the chat feature and type in your question. CARB staff will translate the question for the presenters to respond to. If you're not able to use the chat box, let the interpreter know of your question by raising your hand, and CARB staff will interpret and put your question into the box for you. For any technical issues, we ask that you please direct your comments via chat to Chris Garcia. We also wanted to remind you that this meeting is being recorded and all chats, private or not, are archived. So if you're having issues, you can always revisit the recording at a later date. Let's go over some staff introductions. I'm Layla Gonzalez, the lead staff for the in-use locomotive regulation development. Today I'll be presenting and facilitating some of the discussions. Dylan Miner is the lead on the economic development for the regulation, and he'll be presenting on some of the cost aspects of the draft regulation. Jen Kazumplik is the question and answer moderator today. And as I mentioned before, Chris Garcia is providing the Zoom technical assistance. Even though we've been doing this Zoom format for the whole pandemic now, and we're probably familiar with the process, I'm just going to go through some basic refreshers on Zoom housekeeping items. The first thing that we ask is that you please keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. And second, if you could please rename yourself as shown here on the screen. In order to rename yourself, you're going to click on Participants to bring up the list of names. you'll find yourself and then hover your mouse over the right side of your name to see the More button. When you click the More button, it'll bring up the option to rename yourself. You'll then put your affiliation followed by your first and last name. And if you're a member of the public, you can just use P as your affiliation. The reason why we're asking you to do this is so we have a better understanding and insight as to who makes up the audience today. Anyone not familiar with Zoom, I'm just going to go over some basic functions for when we have our Q&A session. As I mentioned previously, we're just asking that you please keep yourself on mute. And the way you can mute and unmute yourself is by finding and pressing the mute button that's located on the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little mic. And if you're calling in by phone, you could press *6 to mute and unmute yourself. When it's time for verbal questions at the end of the presentation, our last question and answer session, you're going to use the raise your hand feature. To raise your hand, you'll need to click the participants icon at the bottom of your screen and you'll select raise hand. It's like a blue little hand icon. Or if you have a newer version of Zoom, you can look for the reactions button. You'll be able to select raise your hand from that. Then our question and answer moderator, Jen, will call on you to let you know that it's your turn to ask a question. For anyone calling by phone to raise their hand, they're going to need to press *9. And I just want to say we're going to everyone try to limit themselves to maybe like 1 or 2 questions about a minute long, and that's so everyone has a chance to talk. I just want to mention that we're taking comments via the informal comment docket if you don't get a chance to be heard at this time. And additionally, we're always accepting questions and comments through our freight email. So throughout the presentation, you may make comments via the chat feature, and we'll be responding to those comments during the 15-minute Q&A session about midway through. And then again, we'll have a longer Q&A session at the very end. During the shorter session, we're only going to be taking questions through the chat. To ask a question, you'll press the chat button, select the participant named Submit Questions Here, type in your question, and send it in. If you have a question on slide material, please try to identify which slide your question was on, or if your question is on the actual regulatory language or preliminary cost document, just please let us know what page number you're referring to. And just as a reminder, if you're calling in, we'll only be able to take your questions at the very last session of question and answer because that's the only time we're taking verbal questions. And if at any time you're having technical issues, send Chris Garcia a private chat message. In our last workshop held in October 2020, we discussed the concepts for the draft locomotive regulation and some locomotive technologies. At this time, we would like to briefly revisit the emissions locomotives contribute to California, go over the draft regulation and draft regulatory language, and discuss the preliminary cost document. Let's get started. You may recognize these graphics from our October 2020 workshop. These charts show the relative emissions of oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, and particulate matter 2.5 from freight source categories in 2018. Locomotives account for 12% NOx and 8% PM of the state's total freight emissions. As you can see, locomotives are the third largest source category in freight, following trucks and ocean-going vessels. CARB actions are reducing emissions from other major source categories, such as trucks moving towards zero emission, meaning that emissions from locomotives will account for a larger percentage of emissions from freight in the future without any intervention. Essentially, the red box on these slides is going to continue to get larger in comparison to the other boxes. Within the locomotive source category, there are different categories of operators. This pie chart shows Class 1 line haul railroads are the largest locomotive emission contributors in California. Class 1 line haul locomotives account for over 85% of the California NOx and PM emissions from locomotives. The next highest source category is passenger at less than 10%. At first glance, this might indicate that smaller categories such as Class 3 and passengers do not need to be included in a regulation. However, this is far from true, as I will explain later. The US EPA defines emission standards of locomotives by tier. As you can see on this table, locomotives emit different levels of NOx and PM depending on their manufacture year and how they're used. As shown here, line haul locomotives that typically move freight long distances across the nation, and switcher locomotives that generally work within a rail yard or move short distances around a rail yard, have slightly different standards for the same tier level. The emissions from locomotives vary, with pre-Tier 0 being the oldest and dirtiest, and Tier 4 being the newest and cleanest. Tier 4 locomotives are 80 to 90% cleaner than Tier 0. And just so you know, the table here only shows a subset of the locomotive tiers. For the full list, you'll need to go to the EPA's website. Even though locomotives often go through multiple remanufacturers in their lifetime, federal regulation only requires locomotives to meet the emission standards based on its original manufacture date. Okay, so do you remember the pie charts that I just showed you a couple slides ago? And do you recall how I said, even though Class 1 line haul makes up the majority of locomotive emissions, it didn't show the whole picture? Well, this chart shows emissions by tier. You can see industrial, Class 1 switcher, and Class 3 locomotives are typically the dirtiest emitters. Class 1 railroads are still operating a large number of Tier 1 plus and older locomotives. These older locomotives typically emit 6 times more NOx and 20 times more PM than a Tier 4. Class 3 and industrial locomotive railroads have mostly pre-Tier 0 locomotives, meaning many of which were built in the 1950s to 70s. These pre-Tier 0 locomotives emit about 17 times more NOx and 29 times more PM than a Tier 4. The locomotive regulation aims to speed the introduction of cleaner locomotives as well as remove the most dirty locomotives from operating in California. Looking at the emissions per category in another way, this chart shows the average emission factor by category of locomotive. Again, you can see industrial locomotives are the highest emitters, followed by Class 1 switchers and Class 3 locomotives. Now let's briefly go over some health risks associated with NOx and PM emissions. NOx can aggravate lung diseases and lead to respiratory symptoms, hospital admissions, and emergency room visits. PM are tiny particles that can travel deep into the lung, and if small enough, can even travel into the bloodstream. Much research has been done on the health impacts of PM and PM 2.5, and it shows exposure to PM has led to increased asthma cases, emergency room visits, bronchitis, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart attacks, and effects on the nervous system. Illnesses associated with PM exposure can lead to days off work, and long-term exposure can even lead to premature death. If on average, California locomotives were all Tier 4, CARB estimates that there will be fewer cases of the major health outcomes shown here compared to business as usual. For the entire state from 2020 to 2050, we estimate that there would be more than 4,800 fewer cases of cardiopulmonary mortality, more than 1,500 fewer hospitalizations for cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses, and about 2,300 fewer visits to the emergency room for asthma. Again, this is just a Tier 4 statewide average. meaning that the additional benefits of going cleaner than a Tier 4 and even zero emission would further reduce illness numbers. To help with the expedited adoption of cleaner locomotives in areas that are disproportionately impacted by freight, staff have established an additional spending account credit for early adopters of zero emission technologies used within those areas. Based on early projections from the 2010s, CARB assumed Tier 4 locomotive penetration to be about 5% per year. At this rate, it would mean that we would currently be operating with about a 30% Tier 4 California fleet, and it would be 100% Tier 4 by 2034. However, as we just shown, the turnover to Tier 4 has been much slower than we expected, and there's still a very heavy reliance on older locomotives. As other freight sectors become cleaner, such as trucks in California moving towards zero emission technology, there's a greater need for locomotives to reduce their emissions, as there could be cleaner modes of freight transportation. CARB has done an analysis on cargo containers moved by truck versus moved by train, and more details on that specific draft truck versus train analysis can be found on the Reducing Rail Emissions website. And finally, the Zero Emission by 2035 Executive Order N7920, signed by Governor Newsom in 2020, pushes us to move locomotives to zero emission more quickly than they might have without a regulation in place. We first started outreach for the development of the in-use locomotive concepts in 2019. Since then, we've had over 70 meetings, teleconferences, calls, Zoom meetings, team meetings, all with stakeholders, and there's a lot more to come. We've spoken with air agencies, environmental agencies from inside and outside the state, technology companies, equipment manufacturers, academic institutions, community members, railroads, and each of those conversations has informed the language in our draft regulation and our cost assumptions. You can find more information about previously held meetings on the meetings and workshop page. And if you don't find what you need there, please write us via email at the freight@arb.ca.gov email. During our rail yard community listening session, which we had March 4th, there were a few reoccurring comments. They were, more data is needed about regional locomotive emissions and about what's operating in the rail yards. There's a need for information and access to funding that could help mitigate effects of exposure to emissions. There's no clear way to express complaints about noise from trains and no understanding of what can be done, if anything. And in general, CARB needs to hold more listening style events. In the table here, we have attempted to gather the most relevant information for the community to use. As always, feel free to contact us via email for additional questions. Today's workshop will focus on a few aspects of the draft regulatory language and preliminary cost document, and it is not intended as a walkthrough of the language in detail. However, if you do have specific questions on the draft language or cost information, you may send in your questions via chat, and we'll try to address them during our question and answer sessions. Or you can always just send in your questions via email. Starting in January 2020, railroads would start tracking their California locomotive activities. By July 1, 2023, railroads would have to establish a spending account. They would report on their 2022 activity and fund the spending account accordingly. The useful life limit would start in 2030. The locomotive regulation would apply to all owners, operators, sellers, leasers, renters, and manufacturers. There are a few exemptions. Currently, this is the list of locomotives that would be exempt from the regulation. Locomotives with engines less than 1,006 horsepower, training locomotive engines, equipment used on and off rail, military locomotives, and any locomotive operating less than 10 hours per year. For locomotives not exempt, by July 1st, 2023, everyone that operates locomotives in California will need to establish a spending account. Funds to be set aside in each operator's spending account will be dictated by the annual activity and emission level of each locomotive from the prior year. So for example, the funds to be deposited by July 2023 will be based on activity throughout calendar year 2022. Funds in this account must be used to purchase the cleanest available locomotives. If the locomotive is zero emission, activity will create a credit. This means each megawatt hour of zero emission activity will cause the spending account obligation to go down rather than up. This condition will apply until the end of 2034. Funds in the account cannot be commingled. What we mean by this is that the money in the funds should only be the money set aside to comply with this regulation. Once an operator goes to spend their funds, they may of course use other funding to pay for the equipment they need. Starting in 2030, all locomotives 23 years and older are banned from operating in California, meaning in 2030, locomotives built in 2007 or before can no longer operate in California. However, zero-emission locomotives may continue to operate in the state regardless of age. So now let's go over some examples of how the spending account and useful life limit could work. In the two examples I'm going to show you, all locomotives, in this case switchers, operate 200 megawatt hours a year. In one example, the railroad chooses to only purchase Tier 4 locomotives. In the other example, the railroad chooses to invest in zero-emission locomotives. In these examples, we have rounded and simplified the numbers to allow for a better illustration of how it would work. For exact numbers, you would need to see the regulatory language. Starting in 2022, the railroad would begin to track their locomotive activity. This railroad is operating 5 Tier 0 locomotives. Each Tier 0 locomotive will be charged approximately $290,000 for operating 200 megawatt hours. The spending account starts in 2023. The account beginning balance is $0. In July 2023, these 5 locomotives would be charged $1.45 million, shown here rounded up to $1.5 million, and it's based on the 2022 fleet usage. It's then deposited into the account. The railroad is still operating their same Tier 0 fleet throughout 2023. They have not spent any money on new locomotives in 2023. So their ending balance is $1.5 million. In 2024, they start with that $1.5 million. They are charged $1.5 million from their operations in 2023. They again operate the same fleet throughout 2024. However, they now have enough money in their spending account to purchase a Tier 4 locomotive. They spend $2.7 million in 2024, which is the estimated cost of a Tier 4 locomotive. They are left with $0.3 million in their account at the end of the year. In 2025, they add their $1.6 million charge from activity in 2024. They now have a fleet of 4 Tier 0 locomotives, and 1 Tier 4 locomotive they purchased last year is now in service. At the end of 2025, they have an account balance of $1.8 million. In 2026, they start off with 1.8 million, but because they had their Tier 4 in operation in 2025, the spending account charge is reduced to $1.3 million. They now again have enough money in their spending account to purchase another Tier 4 locomotive. They are left with $500,000 at the end of 2026. 2027 is calculated the same. 2028 rolls around and they have enough to purchase another Tier 4 locomotive. By 2029, they only have 2 Tier 0 locomotives left in their fleet. The useful life limit starts in 2030, meaning all the Tier 0 locomotives left in the fleet will be banned from operating in California. They will need to spend approximately $5.4 million on the additional 2 Tier 4 locomotives. Since their spending account only had $1.4 million, they needed to use another $4 million to purchase the last 2 Tier 4 locomotives. In 2030, they now have an all Tier 4 locomotive fleet. Although Tier 4 is much cleaner than a Tier 0, they still emit emissions and have associated health burdens. Therefore, they're still required to fund the spending account. Additionally, they will only be able to operate in California if they are less than 23 years old or they have been operated less than 89,000 megawatt hours. This time, the railroad has decided to only invest in zero-emission locomotives. Starting in 2022, they again track their activity of their 5 Tier 0 locomotives. Each is used 200 megawatt hours. The charge for operating a Tier 0 locomotive is approximately $290,000 each. In 2023, the railroad would deposit $1.5 million into their spending account. At the end of 2023, they have a balance of $1.5 million. Jumping to 2025, the railroad now has enough funds in their spending account to purchase a zero-emission locomotive. The zero-emission locomotive enters into the fleet in 2026. The railroad now has 4 Tier 0 locomotives and 1 zero-emission locomotive. The charge for a Tier 0 locomotive at this time is $340,000, where there is no charge for a ZE locomotive. In addition, until 2034, the operation of zero-emission locomotives creates a credit to be used towards your spending account. Here, you can see in 2027, the zero-emission locomotive reduces the spending account charge by $0.2 million. The railroad continues this pattern of putting money into the spending account and purchasing zero-emission locomotives. By 2029, they have 3 Tier 0 and 2 zero-emission locomotives. These 2 zero-emission locomotives reduce the 2030 spending account charge by $0.4 million. Because of the 2030 useful life limit kicking in 2029, they will need to purchase an additional 3 ZE locomotives to replace their last Tier 0s, which are about to be banned. They will need to add approximately $9 million in addition to the funds in the spending account to do this. In 2030, this railroad will have an all zero-emission fleet. They will continue to accrue spending account credits until 2034, which they can use if they acquire a locomotive that is not zero emission. Additionally, the benefit for this railroad is that zero emission locomotives are not subject to the useful life limit. This is a side-by-side comparison of a Tier 4 and ZE locomotive using the examples we just went through. The biggest takeaway is that Tier 4 locomotives will continue to be charged in the spending account because of the emissions they create. It'll also have to be replaced when it reaches 23 years of age. Whereas the zero emission locomotive, although having a higher upfront cost, may ultimately be the better choice as it creates no spending account obligations and is not subject to the useful life limit. As we mentioned before, use of any ZE locomotive will produce a credit towards the spending account charges. But any zero emission locomotive activity that occurs within a disadvantaged community will result in double credit to be used to offset the spending account charges. We'll explain this in numbers in a little bit, but essentially this measure is designed to help ensure that ZE locomotives are deployed first in disadvantaged communities wherever possible. This is to help address the cumulative burdens from living and working in these areas. To understand the disadvantaged community component better, this is the Cal EnviroScreen webpage that shows designated disadvantaged communities throughout California. As you can see here, they're highlighted in red. Disadvantaged communities are defined as those areas that are disproportionately affected by environmental pollution and other hazards that can lead to negative public health effects. This is based on environmental, health, and socioeconomic data. So back to our example. If I were an operator with a ZE switcher in 2025, I could already count on a credit for each megawatt hour of operation, or around $750 per megawatt hour. For the time I operate within the disadvantaged community, or here the red portion of the map, I get a credit of $1,500 per megawatt hour of operation. To allow for flexibility within the spending account, funds may be used towards the purchase of any zero emission equipment or to advance zero emission technology by pilot and demonstration. If railroads would prefer to use the spending account funds on alternative projects, they may do so, so long as the requirements in 24787 are followed and met. This graphic shows the turnover rates to Tier 4 or cleaner with and without a regulation in place. As you can see on the left-hand side, the predicted adoption of Tier 4 cleaner locomotives is slow or relatively the same without a regulation in place. For example, Class 3 fleets will stay around 10% Tier 4 or cleaner all the way until 2050, and Class 1 fleets will only significantly start to introduce Tier 4 and cleaner into their fleets around 2035. With the spending account and useful life limit in place, the turnover to cleaner technologies is expedited and increased. As you can see on this graphic on the right-hand side that projects the regulation, Tier 4 cleaners slowly ramps up from 2020 to 2025 as a result of the spending account, and then it sharply increases by 2030 because of the useful life limit. In 2030, at least 65% of all locomotive fleets in California will be Tier 4 or cleaner, and by 2040, all locomotives operating in California would be at least Tier 4. In order to address community complaints about needless locomotive idling, we have requirements based on those found in the federal rule. Including an idling requirement in the regulation would allow CARB to enforce excess idling. Starting July 1st, 2023, and every July 1st thereafter, operators will begin reporting information for the activity of their locomotives from the previous calendar year, starting with information about the locomotive itself. Information about activity of each engine and where the engine emissions are happening, as well as any idling in excess of 30 minutes, must also be reported. CARB staff are currently working on electronic submittal format for the reporting requirements. District-specific data has been a consistent request from air districts and communities. Through this regulation, we'll be able to answer that request. With the information we collect, we will be able to understand and communicate the amount and location of locomotive emissions and gain a deeper understanding of the related effects. Those operators wishing to get double credit in the spending account for using ZE will need to add that layer of reporting to show ZE activity within Cal Enviro screen to find disadvantaged communities. CARB is authorized to collect fees to cover the reasonable costs associated with the certification, audit, and compliance of off-road or non-vehicular engines. A yearly administrative payment of approximately $220 per locomotive would be collected from locomotive owners to cover the cost of additional resources to implement the in-use locomotive regulation. This is based on the cost of personnel, equipment, and operational costs for implementation and enforcement. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop here, and we're going to do our first 15-minute question and answer session. So send your questions to submit your question via the chat function. Any regulatory language suggestions, cost information, etc., can be submitted via the informal comment log for consideration until April 16th. And we're always available through our freight email. And I just want to remind you, if you're referring to a slide in the presentation, just let us know which one, and let us know the reg language or cost doc page number if you're going to talk about that. So Jen, do you want to go ahead and get started with answering some questions?
Sure. I'm just going to go through the chat submittals in the order that they were received. And just a reminder, this isn't your last. If you can't think of your question or you can't get it in there in time, there's going to be another Q&A after this, and then we have the informal docket. We have all kinds of ways for you to contribute. I'm going to slow down my talking. So first question in the chat is from Dawn Norton at the California Short Line Rail Association. Regarding exempt locomotives, where does the figure 1,006 horsepower come from? What type of unit are you intending to exempt? And I will go ahead and ask Justin Wong to answer this one for us.
Thank you, Don, for your question. Regarding 1,006 horsepower, it is coming directly from 40 Code of Federal Regulation 40 CFR 1033. How it's defined is vehicles propelled by engines with total rated horsepower less than 1,006 horsepower are not locomotives. And that 1,006 horsepower, the odd number is equivalent to 750 kilowatts. So this is how US EPA defines locomotive in their Code of Federal Regulations. And this exempts the smallest rail equipment.
Anything else for the team to add to that? Okay, I'm going to move on. Next question is from Alyssa Yan at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Do the zero emission credits not apply to a locomotive funded by the Carl Moyer program? It is correct. As the regulation is written right now, a ZE locomotive would not qualify for generation of ZE credit if the locomotive is required by another rule or regulation or agreement. And that would include public grants, since those are governed by agreements. With that said, I would like to add that we're, on these funding types, we're revisiting the incentives and how they would work with the regulation. We want to optimize opportunities for everybody. So, before I move on from that question, does the team have anything to add? No? Okay. Next question is from David Schonbrun. And the question is, you need to start the discussion of spending accounts with an explanation of the regulatory scheme embodied in the spending account. Hearing the details hold on a second. Getting a lot of incoming messages all at the same time. Hearing the details is not helpful without an understanding of the rationale. Also, is this scheme dependent on the MOUs with the Class 1 railroads? So I'll take this one thing at a time. The spending account is intended to motivate operators to either use their cleanest equipment in the state or to accelerate their uptake of cleanest equipment possible as quickly as possible. And the unique design of the spending account is specifically because we are doing what we are able to do in this space. And this is something that we have talked about in many kinds of outreach, and individual outreach can happen too. David, if you would like to talk more about this, you can write into the freight email and we can talk to you about it in more detail. To your other question, is this scheme dependent on the MOUs with the Class 1 railroads? So in the South Coast Air District, we have a specific agreement with the 2 largest railroads operating in the state, and then statewide, we also had another agreement that sunsetted. This scheme is not dependent on those MOUs. It's a completely separate endeavor. Does the team have anything to add to my answers there? No? Okay. The next question is from Andrew Fox. The question is, are you contemplating an exemption for museums which operate vintage diesels and steam locomotives? And I will ask Justin to answer this one for us.
Yes, so currently only exemptions are listed on the draft regulation language, section 2478.2. So it does not include museums, vintage locomotives, or steam locomotives. However, we're continuing to improve on the regulation language and staying flexible as we receive feedback. So please do send us data and feedback, and we'll consider them as we move forward, especially specifics on specifics such as like how many of these vintage or steam locomotives are operating in the state, and any specific and details will help. Thank you.
Okay, does the team have anything to add to that one? All right, I'm gonna move on. I just wanna do a brief commercial. I am named submit questions here. So if you want to submit your question, that's where you should submit it. I am getting some word from the team that submittals are happening to several places. So the quickest way to get your answer is to submit to the person named submit questions here. Let's see, Jeff. Reasoning, what is the reasoning behind exempting less than 1,006 horsepower locomotives from the regulation? And Justin, would you be willing to help? This is Jeff. So we have 2 Jeffs. I should clarify for my team. We have 2 Jeffs asking a few similar questions. This is a Jeff from the public.
Yes, so 1,006 horsepower is how Code of Federal Regulation defines. It's kind of cut off for what is considered locomotive. So below that, it exempts the smallest of the small rail equipment. So there are sometimes called critters that sometimes does, tiny work or maintenance and such of those things.
Okay, thank you. Anything else from the team there? All right. Next question is from Don Norton at the Short Line Railroad Association. Where did you get your cost numbers for the zero emission locomotives? To my knowledge, battery hydrogen prototypes for road switch duty currently cost $7 to $11 million. I will put this one to Dylan.
Sure. Thank you for the question. We collected costs from a number of different sources and understand that, especially when it comes to zero emission technologies, those costs are still being determined, and that the locomotives are in progress to reach commercialization. So if you have estimates or cost data, that you would like to provide to us. We will definitely take that into consideration as we develop our cost analysis.
And Don, I know we've heard from you before in the freight inbox, so just feel free to request a talk or send us whatever information you have. Next question is from Felipe Fuentes. Hello, Felipe. I believe we've spoken before. Felipe's question is, please explain the PM and annual factors by year chart. How does the annual factor work? So I would like to ask Justin to answer this one.
And then Layla, maybe you could go back to that slide as well.
So that would be helpful. So the spending account, if I quote the number, it would be section 2478.4 Untitled Spending Account, and subpart parenthesis C starts the equation. So essentially funding amount of spending account is calculated by emission levels of certain engine. Let's say you have an engine and you have the emission factors. And PM factor, so it's just a factor, is pre-calculated, and annual factor are looked up in the table in that same section of the regulation. And you're essentially plugging in, and PM factor and annual factor are just a little background. The PM factor accounts for the fact that same amount of PM has more impact, and annual factor takes into account, well, dollar amount and annual increase of population and such. So it's kind of hard to explain without the equation, but in a sense, the funding total takes into these two factors, and it's a simple calculation where you look up the year of the reporting and simply plug it into the regulation, or not regulation, in the reporting to calculate the funding total.
Okay, Justin, do you want to, is the team still working on pulling up any visuals, or is that, are you concluding?
I mean, we can pull up a visual at the last Q&A session if you would like to see it in further detail, but it took me a minute, sorry.
Yeah, why don't we plan to, in the next Q&A session, to have that part of the reg language up, and then we can kind of go through it in a little bit more detail with the relevant screen. I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I'm counting on team to give me a time check or make any executive decisions about when we should wrap on this side. I currently have about 10 chat questions in the queue. Next question is from Jorge. The screen cuts off your last name. I'm so sorry. From the MDA QMD. Hello. Can the spending account balance be combined with other grant funding sources, such as the Carl Moyer program? So the answer is a qualified yes. If it's not prohibited by a separate requirement. So other funding sources might have their own rules about co-funding requirements. But on our side, the answer is yes, they can be combined with other grant funding sources. And I'll just reiterate what I said earlier, especially since my first life in CARB was in Carl Moyer. We're continuing to speak to Moyer and all the incentives folks about how to make everything work together. So we're going to do our best with all of that. Anything from the team to add there?
No, but I'm just going to give it 5 more minutes.
Okay. Next question is from Timothy French. Your presentation references that all funds deposited must come from compliance with the regulation. What is the source of the funds? Are the locomotive owner operators responsible for funding the spending accounts at issue? So yes, you have grasped the spending account. The idea is each operator operates a locomotive, and depending on how dirty that locomotive is, they will put a per unit of use amount in their own account, and then they will take that money and buy their own equipment with it, their own cleaner equipment. So yeah, it's their money. Anything for the team to add there? Okay. Tom Gallagher, with the consumption of alternative fuels during the 2021 to 2034 time period in individual locomotives, alter the fees charged for accrual in the annual spending account. Alternative fuels. So I assume you're talking about something like renewable diesel. If you were, for example, talking about natural gas, the accrual would alter according to what's coming out of the stack or the tailpipe, right? So lower emissions means a lower amount going into the spending account. As far as provisions for things like renewable diesel, that's an ongoing conversation, but it's not currently written into the draft regulation. Justin, do you have anything to add? No?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't hear that first part. Tim Sassin, I apologize if I'm saying your last name incorrectly. Could the spending account be applied to hydrogen fuel infrastructure to fuel a zero emission train? And could additional spending account credit be given to further incentivize this investment? Justin?
The question was two-part. One was hydrogen fueling infrastructure part.
Hmm.
And the answer is, I'd like to just, until, in the section, also spending account section, 2478.4 on B, that's a Bravo Delta, B1D, until December 31, 2033. Funds may be used to pilot or demonstrate zero-emission locomotive technology or zero-emission infrastructure needed to support zero-emission locomotives. So yes, hydrogen fueling infrastructure would most likely be under that category. And Jen, could you, was there, I think there was a more
I think, yeah, so I think we, the second part, so I just adding on to what Justin said earlier, we have realized recently the reg language isn't perfectly clear about fueling of infrastructure. The intent is that fueling, that infrastructure is going to be part of what's allowed for spending in the spending account, always to the greatest extent possible. So if that's not perfectly clear now, it will be made perfectly clear. Could additional spending account credit be given to further incentivize this investment? Additional spending account credit is given for the use of zero emission equipment in disadvantaged communities anytime before the zero emission requirement is official, which I believe like any spending through into 2034, if I'm remembering my years correctly. Someone on the team correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct.
Before, you will get, so you basically the ZE credit for use of equipment is doubled for equipment being used inside of disadvantaged communities. If it's being used outside of disadvantaged communities, there's still a credit for the use of that ZE equipment.
I would just jump in, Jen, with basically I don't think the credit discriminates between battery or the type of ZE equipment. And if that's the question, then we can't, the way it's intended right now is not to, we're not preferentially providing additional credit for different types of technology. Zero emission is zero emission, whether it's battery or fuel cell.
Correct. And Tim, if your question is specifically on the credit or incentive for the use of fueling infrastructure, zero emission fueling infrastructure, there's nothing currently written into the regulation. And we haven't considered how that would be valued. So that would be part of an ongoing conversation. Layla, how close are we to time? I have 14 messages in the queue.
I think we should call it and move on.
Okay, don't forget there's another Q&A, so I'm going to start right where we left off with the messages that are in the chat. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now we're going to go to the preliminary cost document, and this is going to be Dylan Miner. Dylan, go ahead.
Thank you, Layla. We released the preliminary cost document to present and get feedback on the assumptions and costs we are using to determine the cost for the regulation. The cost-benefit analysis for the regulation will be contained in the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, also known as the SRIA. The SRIA includes analysis of benefits and costs to typical businesses, small businesses, and individuals. It also analyzes fiscal impacts to local and state government and macroeconomic impacts to California. If you have additional data for us to consider in our analysis, we ask that you please submit it by April 16th. Your comments are important as they will help us to ensure that we accurately account for and consider the effects on the California economy. Staff assumptions are listed on page 4 of the preliminary cost document. These include assumptions of railroads' operations and their actions in response to the regulation, as well as relevant characteristics of zero emissions technologies. We are particularly interested in hearing or receiving your thoughts on a few assumptions about advanced technology purchases in railroad operations, which I will cover next. Regarding advanced technology, we are interested in feedback on railroads' voluntary deployment of advanced locomotives. Given the reduced compliance cost for operating locomotives with lower than Tier 4 emission levels and the credits available for deploying zero emission technologies, what percentage of the annual spending account funds should CARB expect railroads to put towards these advanced locomotives? Regarding assumptions about Class 1 railroads, we observed that they adjusted their operations by sending cleaner locomotives to the South Coast Air Basin after making a voluntary commitment to reduce their fleet's average emissions, following a 1998 Memorandum of Understanding. Based on this prior choice and their proven ability to make operational changes, do you expect Class 1 operations to change on a per-tier basis? And if so, to what extent? As you read through the preliminary cost document, please keep these questions in mind. Do costs identified reflect current prices? Are there additional data sources that CARB should consider? Do advanced technology costs reflect your estimates, assuming commercial availability of cleaner locomotives in 2030 and zero emission locomotives in 2035? This last question in particular addresses the comment made earlier about prices for advanced technology, that we are looking specifically for those prices starting in 2030 and zero emission for 2035. Where costs don't align with current prices or future prices as projected, please let us know and provide your data sources. Again, the better we can identify costs, the more accurate we will be able to determine the financial costs and benefits of the regulation as a whole. Following this workshop and the close of the comment period on April 16th, staff will review comments and new data sources. We will also schedule follow-up meetings as needed. After reviewing any additional data we receive, staff will refine the cost model to determine the incremental cost of the regulation concepts and alternatives. The Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, which again is the cost-benefit document for the regulation, is expected in December of this year. Thank you, and I'll now hand it back to Layla.
Thanks, Dylan. As Dylan just mentioned, the next big step is to get the SRIA completed. This is why now is the time to get your cost data into us to consider. We're going to continue working with stakeholders throughout the regulatory process, and the first board hearing is tentatively scheduled in April 2022. Reporting starts July 2023 for 2022 activities. So things are coming up quick. As I mentioned, the informal comment log is open and it's available on our website until April 16th. Also, for any more information, you can always visit our Reducing Rail Emissions webpage. And here we are again at the end, and it's our final Q&A. So now you can actually raise your hand for verbal questions, and callers press *9 to raise your hand, or just go ahead and send them through chat like we have been. Again, any regulatory language suggestions, cost information, etc. can be submitted through the comment log until April 16th, and you can always reach us through the freight email. If you're referring to a slide, can you just let us know which one so I can pull it up? Or if you're talking about reg language or the cost document, can you let us know what page you're looking at? So I can also try to get that up there. All right, Jen, let's start answering some more questions.
Okay, so I'm going to add that I'm not able to, we have almost 200 participants. And when a hand is raised, I have to scroll the whole 200 to find raised hands. So I'm going to do my best to just continuously scroll and watch for people with raised hands. But since we have a lot of chat questions in the queue, I'm going to start with those. Yasmin from Earth Justice, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Under this current proposal, the spending account funds could they be spent on other rail yard equipment besides locomotives? For this rule to reduce harmful emissions from locomotives, the funds should be limited to spending on zero emission locomotives only. So we've included as many measures as we are able to encourage early spending on zero emission locomotives. But as we explained in the timeline, starting in 2035, that will be the only eligible use of spending account funds. The answer to your first question about can the spending account funds be spent on other equipment besides locomotives? Yes, under the alternative concepts in the regulation, the spending can go to any zero emission equipment within 3 miles of where locomotives operate. Any zero emission equipment. So there are some additional requirements for those projects to qualify so that we can ensure we're getting good reductions, but yeah, the answer to your question is absolutely. Does the team have anything to add there? Okay. Next question is from Andrew Fox, and I might lean on Layla for this one. What happens to the money if a railroad ends up with a net zero emission credit balance? Layla, are you able to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Like I mentioned before, if you end up with a net emission balance, you can use that balance up until 2034 if you do acquire a locomotive that isn't currently a zero emission. So maybe you get a tier 3 or something, and you can use your credits towards that. At this point, it doesn't have any value, so you can't trade with anyone, and they're not worth any money or anything. But we're always taking suggestions, so if you have an idea or you have some comments about how we should be handling the net credit at the end, then go ahead and submit those to us, and we'll be taking those into consideration.
Next question is from Felipe. Hello. Is the alternative spending plan only available to operators who go directly to ZE locomotives? I believe it is only for ZE equipment. Is that correct, team? Anything to add?
Yeah, it's only for zero emission equipment.
Yeah. And please don't feel concerned about my uncertainty. That the reg is evolving because we're constantly taking input from people. So that's the reason for my hesitation. The next question is pretty long. It's from Michael Deutsch. My question pertains to the singular focus on zero emission locomotives and not near zero emission locomotives. Many of the zero emission technologies are a significant number of years off from a viable broad application and affordability. While there have been small pockets of test pilots, nothing is near scale based on my research. If the hydrogen or electricity was produced using non-renewable resources, then zero emission vehicles are still being powered by carbon intensive sources. If the goal is to see decarbonization as soon as possible, why not give railroads the option to leverage renewable natural gas locomotives? I edited extra words, but I think I got the point across. Justin, are you able to take this one?
Yes. So CARB's goal is to reduce emissions from locomotives, and we encourage that all routes that will reduce emissions. And locomotive operators are and always have been free to purchase locomotives with different fuel that meet their needs, including natural gas locomotives. And CARB wants to reduce emissions from locomotive, and we acknowledge that there are different pathways to reduce emissions for different applications. So we do encourage all pathways that can reduce emissions. And the regulation we're discussing today is the regulation to reduce stack and tailpipe emissions. And CARB is pursuing all avenues to reduce all emissions, both criteria and GHG emissions through other, also through other fuel rules and incentives and etc.
Thank you. Anything else from the team on that one? Okay. Mike Rush, if you're listening, I'm gonna unmute your mic in just a moment because you said you would like to say a few words. But right before I do that, I will ask Scott Myers from OptiFuel. I see that you submitted a question about the LCFS program. If you'll write to us at the freight email box, which I think we've posted into the chat a few times, we will get you to the proper person to answer that question. But having minimal LCFS background on the team and being that that's not in our house, we want to make sure you get your question answered. So contact us and we'll set you up. So now I'm going to look for Mike Rush in these 200 participants. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay, Mike, I'm going to send you a request to unmute yourself, and then you'll have to do that, and then you can then you can speak. My screen re-rendered, sorry. Okay, Mike, you should be able to unmute yourself.
It worked, thank you. Thank you for CARB staff for indulging the railroad industry. We would like to I have a one-page statement I'd like to offer on behalf of the industry. And first of all, let me just spend a minute saying who I am. I'm with the Association of American Railroads. I think most of the people on this phone call know who the AAR is, but for those of you who don't, we are a national trade association representing both all the large freight railroads, many of the small freight railroads, and passenger railroads as well. And of course, we represent both the large railroads, freight railroads that operate in California, several smaller freight railroads, and Amtrak, of course, which has a California presence too. From my personal perspective, I'm Senior Vice President of Safety and Operations with AAR. I've been involved in emissions issues both at the EPA level and with CARB since the early 1990s. I've been involved, I was involved with the negotiation of the Fleet Average Agreement, as well as the 2005 MOU, and have been involved with CARB and EPA matters consistently over the last several decades. So we just thought it was important, given that this is about my members and about reducing locomotive emissions, to give the industry's perspective. And again, so this will just, it's a one-page statement. And again, thank you for your indulgence. So this workshop takes place in the context of a national discussion on improving air quality. And for decades, the railroads have demonstrated their commitment to being a partner in improving air quality. And we look forward to continue to playing a significant role. For many years, railroads have undertaken initiatives to address air quality in California, both on their own and working with CARB and local air districts. These efforts go back as far as the 1990s, as we've talked about today. Railroads have been pursuing technological investments changing operations to limit emissions impacts, and entered into, of course, the fleet average agreement with CARB. As CARB has verified, the railroads have been in 100% compliance with the fleet average agreement since its inception. And of course, the 2005 MOU has lapsed, as you pointed out earlier. Railroad initiatives to address air quality continue today. For example, this year, BNSF is partnering with WABTEC and the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District in coordination with CARB on testing a battery-powered locomotive, a line haul locomotive between Barstow and Stockton. Pacific Harbor Lines and Progress Rail are demonstrating a battery-powered switch locomotive at the Los Angeles and Long Beach ports. Elsewhere, the railroad industry is exploring hydrogen-powered locomotives. Canadian Pacific has launched a hydrogen locomotive program to test a line haul locomotive powered by hydrogen fuel cells and batteries. Earlier this month, in testimony before Congress, Genesee in Wyoming, WABTEC, and Carnegie Mellon University proposed a public-private partnership, the Freight Rail Innovation Institute, to investigate hydrogen-powered and battery-powered locomotives. Railroads have also devoted resources to reducing emissions in rail yards. In the last 2 years, BNSF and Union Pacific updated emissions inventories for major yards in California. These updates show that emissions of criteria pollutants have been reduced more than 70% compared to 2005. Union Pacific also coordinated with CARB to partner with 2 air districts to bring the first single-engine Tier 4 switcher locomotives into operation. With these initiatives that can truly make a difference in air quality as background, AAR and its member railroads are both puzzled and disappointed at the draft regulatory proposals unveiled by CARB's staff. Discarding the cooperative relationship of the past, CARB offers proposals that it does not have the authority to issue and that do not provide identifiable emissions reductions. The proposals are impractical, would significantly burden both interstate and interstate railroad operations, and would impose tremendous costs on California railroads. Instead of encouraging rail transportation to reduce emissions and congestion, particularly intermodal transportation, the CARB proposals would divert traffic away from railroads and onto trucks traveling California highways. We encourage CARB to pursue initiatives that will truly improve air quality in California, facilitating the innovative technology that California is known for. We will provide additional comments at appropriate times during the CARB regulatory process. And once again, we thank CARB staff for the opportunity to make this statement and hopefully look forward to a cooperative relationship going forward.
I'm going to let the translators breathe for just a minute. Okay. And I'm going to find my place. We have a lot more questions waiting in the chat, and I have also several more raised hands. I'm going to stick with raised hands for just a moment. I'm going to go to Yasmin at Earth Justice. I'm going to send you a request, and then you'll have to unmute yourself, and then you can go ahead, Yasmin.
Hi, thank you. This is Yasmin Adjalides with Earth Justice. I'm located in Los Angeles. I just want to start by saying thank you for hosting this workshop and for the opportunity to provide feedback on the draft regulatory language. As CARB knows, locomotives are highly polluting and disproportionately impact the health of low-income communities and communities of color. CARB, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and the US EPA have for over a decade promised relief from pollution from locomotives, but that relief has largely failed to come. So California really needs to be a leader in encouraging zero-emission locomotive technology. Overall, Earth Justice is supportive of CARB pursuing a proposed in-use locomotive regulation. We really appreciate the agency's focus on moving locomotive operations in California to zero emissions, and that this shift prioritizes communities that suffer the most from this pollution. We also appreciate that under the proposed approach, the billion-dollar railroad industry will need to pay to clean up its dirty operations, and no public dollars will be spent on this much-needed cleanup. But we do think that the rule is too weak to provide the relief that communities desperately need. We would like to see the following 2 changes made to the rule. So 1, that all spending account funds should only be used on zero-emission locomotive technology beginning immediately as soon as the spending account funds become available. And then 2nd, after 2030, locomotives that are 23 years or older should be forced to retire unless they are zero emissions. So these are the 2 key changes that we think would make a really would make the rule very effective. And so we really encourage CARB to adopt them. But otherwise, thank you so much for your work on this rule.
Thank you, Yasmin. I'm going to go with hands for at least 2 more questions here. Bill McGavern, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself next.
Thanks. Bill McGavern with the Coalition for Clean Air. And we see a strong need for this rulemaking because, as your presentation noted, locomotives are a significant source of the toxic diesel exhaust that is wreaking a disproportionate burden on people who have to breathe the air downwind from rail yards and from heavily traveled rail routes in California. And unfortunately, this is not a problem that will take care of itself or get better on its own. In fact, the truth is that CARB has documented that the big railroads are actually bringing dirty old locomotives into Southern California rather than bringing us newer, cleaner engines. So there is a need for a regulation. It would be ideal for US EPA to be part of this, and we hope that they will be, but after all these years of waiting, we certainly cannot continue to just wait for the federal government to come to our rescue. So it's important that California, as it has when it comes to cars and trucks and many other kinds of engines, establish our own regulations to require the cleanup of locomotive pollution in California. So we very much support this rulemaking going forward, and we'll continue to participate in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to take one more question at the mic since we have had mostly chat questions so far. So next is going to be LaDonna Williams. I'm going to send you a message to unmute yourself.
Okay, am I unmuted?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. LaDonna Williams, All Positives Possible. I just wanted to make the point, you know, we heard from the industry that spoke about them being a very health protective industry. Yet we know the studies from CARB, and we really appreciate that CARB is doing their due diligence on that 70% of residents have cancer when they're located within, what, a mile of these railroads. And that's very concerning when you consider the fact that there's been a practice allowing railroads to be located next to the most disadvantaged low-income communities of color. Many of them can literally walk out of their front door and take maybe 50 steps across the street, and there's a railroad that comes through their street. Or, I mean, from one end of the bridge, Vallejo area, to down there in Hunters Point, and I'm sure beyond, you can look at the most disadvantaged communities who have the railroads, they have raw sewage plants, they have all of these compounding industries, refineries. They're all like just wreaking havoc on the health of the communities. I'd like to know what this industry person, Mr. Rush, appreciated his information, but I'd like to know what are they actually doing as an industry to put funds in the hands of those communities and those lives that have been compromised by their industry. And I also want to know what CARB is doing to ensure that adequate funding is being put into educating and doing outreach and providing resources to really do some mitigation, some, you know, I don't know, out of the box thinking of barriers and things that could be put in place for those that can't afford to move. You know, the mindset is always, well, they need to move. You know, why don't they move? Well, how about the industry and the agencies not allowing these polluting sources to invade upon the communities who could least afford to pack up and move? So, you know, I call both CARB and industry, the railroads, to task on what resources, and I mean not, you know, the pittance that they usually throw at us, but we want to see some significant funding being put into protecting lives and actually hoping that reduce zero emissions, projects on these trains will actually work. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, LaDonna. I know that was part comment and request, and also part question for CARB. And I think you are in an ongoing conversation with us about how we can do more, and we really appreciate that. There's no short way to answer your request. We're working through the rail yard listening sessions and the community air protection program to get closer to communities, to understanding what everybody is dealing with, and to figuring out ways to not just tell you that something better is going to happen in 15 years, but to give you answers about what you can do right now. So I really hear you in that request. And through the listening sessions and the community protection program, and also just through message us, keep talking to us. I appreciate that you do that. I know it takes a lot of time and it's very difficult to prioritize. So stay in the conversation with us. We want to keep talking to you about it. Anything to add from the team? No? Okay.
Nope.
All right, I don't see hands. I'm gonna go back to the chat. Do we have till 4? Is that right?
We're scheduled to go till 4 if we
We're
need to,
scheduled to go
yes.
till 4 if we need to. Okay, that's good for me to know. I have a quick question from Tim at Ballard. Will a recording of this webinar be available? It's planned. It's intended that a recording will be available, barring technical issues. We plan to make a recording available. This is a new thing that we're doing. We haven't always done it. So hopefully we got all the bells and whistles right this time and we'll be able to do it. I'm gonna go back. We had a question from Don Norton. I just have to find it. Give me just a moment.
Well, Jen, as you're looking back, maybe this would be a good time to go through. I know that at the first part of the Q&A session, we had a question about the PM multipliers, and I know we were going to go back and Justin was going to pull up the reg language and share his screen so that he could kind of talk through that section. Justin, is that something that you'd be able to do right now?
Yes. Let's see. Oh, this is who can okay. Why is it not showing up? Because this is, sorry, too many windows open. There you go. Okay, can you see the draft language?
Yes, we can see it.
So the PM and PM factor and annual factor. So this equation is the very basic equation that determines the funding amount. And in this equation, NOx and PM emission factors are, well, emission factors of the locomotive. So if you had a locomotive that you are reporting for, let's say calendar year 2023, you are tracking the usage of locomotive and you know the emission factor of the locomotive. And then PM factor, since you are reporting for 2023, you simply go down to this table and look up 2023. So PM factor takes into account, as I mentioned earlier, that the fact that PM has larger impact compared to the same amount of NOx. So that's where the PM factor comes in. And the annual factor converts that emissions into dollar amount. And the annual factor steadily increases, mainly due to inflation and also the population increases. So same amount of emissions would cause have a larger impact. So that's why the annual that's what annual factor is taking into account. And so you'll be plugging in those values for whatever year you are looking into. And we are working to make this calculation and the reporting process as easy as possible for the reporting entities. So I'll be happy to follow up with you as necessary.
Okay. Let's see. So this one is from Don Norton. Railroading is capital intensive. Using data and industry rules for all short lines, the smaller railroads, to calculate short line income after expenses, I get an answer of $1.6 million to $2 million per year. The average locomotive fleet is 8 units. How is a company supposed to absorb over $1.6 million per year in spending account contributions given this reality? Dylan, are you able to take this one?
Sure. Thank you, Don. We really appreciate the information you've provided us and would like to follow up for further conversation with you if possible. We will be taking into account the financial situations of companies, and typically we request if companies can provide 3 years of audited financial statements for us to be able to fully understand the financial situation that these smaller operators are experiencing. That said, the short line rails often operate with the oldest and dirtiest locomotives from an emissions perspective. So we are very much continuing to pursue strategies and would like to see those locomotives turned over as shown through the regulation. We do have incentive programs that may be available in your air district, and small railroads would be ideal operators for zero emission locomotive technology as well. That is, some switchers may be able to be replaced with zero emission rail car movers or lower cost equipment. And as those technologies become more commercially available, they would be best suited for many of those applications. So thanks again for your comments, and we would look forward to further discussion and data as you're able to provide it.
Okay. Next, I'm going to Mike Rush from AAR, who read the statement about railroad industry, would like to respond to LaDonna's comments and questions. So Mike, I'm going to go ahead and send you a request to unmute yourself right now. Mike, you need to unmute yourself if you would like to talk.
Took a while to work. Thank you. So I just want a chance to address Ms. Williams' points. Very heartfelt, very genuine, appreciate it. So, and there's no simple answer, and I'm not pretending there is a simple answer. I think there's a combination of things that need to take place. So I'd just like to point out a couple of things. So I would like to point out something that I did include in my statement, which is in major rail yards in California, BNSF and UP, have reduced yard emissions of criteria pollutants by 70%. That's not 100%, to be clear. And that's done through various measures, such as using electric cranes, various things you do on site, as well as of course lower emitting locomotives. And going forward, I think there are obviously technologies we've talked about. Again, with respect to yard emissions. Look at the Pacific Harbor lines. We'll be demonstrating a battery-powered switch locomotive. That's a generic response with respect to individual yards. Of course, I can't, and I'm not going to go into individual yard efforts here. But I will say, her points certainly don't fall on deaf ears as far as the industry is concerned. We take it very seriously. I think we've done a lot in the past, and we understand there's more to be done. So I just want to make sure she understands that we are listening and we don't ignore those comments. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mike. This next one is from Michael Deutsch. As a railroad shipper, what will prevent the railroads from financing their spending accounts by passing through rate escalations to their customers? What is intended to be a savings account can be just built into the cost models for shipper rates, leading to higher freight costs. And Dylan, I'm going to ask you to take this one.
Great. Thanks, Jen, and thanks for the question. Rates can be influenced by a number of different situations and components that go into every business. And that's part of why, as part of the standardized regulatory impact assessment, we consider the costs both to businesses as well as to individuals and to local and state government. All of that is part of the comprehensive view that we take. And again, we're looking for the incremental cost associated with the regulation, not the entire cost of all the equipment, because as you know, the railroads are currently purchasing new locomotives, refurbishing, remanufacturing the equipment that they currently have. So the analysis that we plan to release in December will more fully capture macroeconomic impacts, including potential costs. That said, all sectors are under regulation pretty well across the board when it comes to mobile sources, and trucks being usually the alternative to rail. We would expect that there will be similar costs to take into account on any mode of transportation. Anything else to add for the team, or correct or clarify? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Dylan. Next question is a clarifying question from Felipe. Hi, Felipe Fuentes asking about the underlying math on how the annual NPM factors are derived. And Justin, I'll ask you to take this one.
Yes, thank you, Felipe. So I'll touch on a high level because it's a fairly involved process, so there will be no time to go through that into detail. So the charge is based on the impact of emissions on health. So it's tied to the health. And emissions can be tied to mortality incidents, and those mortality incidents are assigned a cost. So these are calculated emissions values are used to estimate how many mortality incidents are caused from the activity of each locomotive, hence that emissions tying to the mortality incidents and to the cost. And that's what PM factor and annual factor are based on.
Anything else from the team there? Okay. Next, for the ongoing conversation between community and AAR and CARB, LaDonna would like one more moment at the mic. So LaDonna, I'm going to send you a request to unmute yourself, and then you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, I think I unmuted.
I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to briefly respond to Mr. Rush to say I appreciate, his response that they have reduced their emissions by 70%. And since the 70% is also that number of cancer rates within our communities, to get to that zero emission, right, reduction on their part would then possibly give us zero cancer rates in our community. So I hope that he's in full support of what you all are doing to get to that zero emissions from those the industry that he oversees. But again, we definitely need that support from railroads to to work with you to get to that zero emissions sooner rather than later. What was that, 2030? Was it 2030, 2020, or whatever it is? We can't wait that long. We need that ASAP. Thank you.
That, just to clarify, LaDonna, and Layla, correct me if I'm wrong, the zero emission spending account requirement starts in 2035. Yeah. So the next one is one that I've been scouring the chat, and I realize I have overlooked one that was sent in a few minutes ago from Timothy French. What obligations will the new regulation impose on locomotive manufacturers? So no obligations, I would say, and team, please correct me if I'm wrong. This is an obligation on those operating locomotives, but I would say locomotive manufacturers to definitely see it as a call to innovate and accelerate their development and manufacturing of clean technologies, because there are going to be a lot of regulated community looking to comply in all different kinds of ways.
I am actually just going to pop in really quick, but don't forget they do have record keeping requirements. So they have an obligation for 3 years to keep records of the locomotives that they build and send to California.
Thank you so much. I completely forgot. Anything else, team, about what obligations for locomotive manufacturers? No? Yes? No?
Justin, go first, and then I'll hop in.
Yeah, so we would like definitely reach out to also OEMs to make it easier, compliance easier for the reporting entities. So we'd like to do that. It's not an obligation, but we'd like to definitely work with you. And also this regulation would definitely create demand for cleaner locomotives. And in the past, the manufacturers have shown resourcefulness in developing and commercializing cleaner technology when there's demand. So we'd definitely like to see more cleaner locomotives coming from the manufacturers.
Nothing to add to that, Jeff.
Okay, I was looking at the J box. Okay, I'm scouring the call list for raised hands. I'm looking for chats in the chat box. At this moment, I am not seeing any new chat questions. That doesn't mean we're going to shut it down right this minute. So if you've got something, go ahead and raise your hand or send something into the chat box. And I'll just do a quick commercial for the freight email and for the informal comment docket. Those are both places where you can submit your questions. We read those emails and comments every single day, and we take them very seriously. All of this stuff is going to be added to the things that we consider for the writing of this regulation. I see a question in the chat from Jeff Van Schaik. Between now and April 2022, what are the critical dates we are working against? Assuming that the we are operators, Jeff, and please correct me if I've misinterpreted the source of the question. Between now and April 2022, the compliance obligation for operators is to begin tracking activity and emission levels of locomotives. And the specific language about that is in the regulation. As far as regulation development dates, like what milestones should you be looking for? I believe Layla can answer the questions about what to expect next within the regulation development.
Yeah, I mean, like we kind of went over in the presentation, the next big thing would be the SRIA, which would be sent to the Department of Finance in December of this year. So we need all the cost information we could get. The ISOR package and stuff will be released probably if we're going to the board in March, which tentatively we're scheduled for that. In April. tentatively. Then the ISR would be released in March for a 45-day comment period. Then we'd have our first board hearing, and this is a 2-hearing regulation. So those would be the next big thing. So I would definitely, right now is the time that we need like input the most. We need your cost input. We need, any comments you have on the regulatory language. Now's the time, because we're really coming up to that April 2020 board hearing date really quickly. So yeah. Jen, do we have any other chat questions or anything coming through?
So I am not, hold on just a second. Let me just do one more. Bear with me while I do one more quick scan. I don't want to say none if there are some.
And I just want to say if we did miss one by chance, because, there's a ton of chats that came in all at once, and I don't know, maybe people on the phone might have had trouble calling in or getting their hands raised or whatever, just go ahead and email us or put your comment in the informal comment docket until April 16th. Like I said, we're always here. We're, ready to get your questions and comments. And yeah.
So I do not see anything new in the chat. I don't see any raised hands. I'm just going to scan one more time. I see nothing. And don't panic. Like we've been saying, this doesn't really mean a lot if you didn't get to speak in this moment. All the opportunities are pretty equal as far as we're concerned. If you have a question tomorrow, it'll get the same weight as a question today.
Thanks, Jen. I think with that, I really appreciate everyone joining us. We had over 180 participants, so imagine we will have a lot of follow-up in the coming weeks. Appreciate your input, and I'll turn it over to Layla so you can finish and send us off. Thanks.
Yeah, after I was talking so much, I've been fumbling over my words. So I just wanted to clarify, board hearing date, April 2022. So that's the date. And again, yeah, like Ajay said, thank you so much. This concludes our 3rd in-use locomotive workshop. And thank you so much for your participation. Again, you can send us comments, formal comment docket, email. Everybody have a great evening, and thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, thank you.